On the morning of the 9th of March, 1974, on a small Philippine island called Lubang, a 52-year-old man in a deteriorating Japanese Army uniform walked out of the jungle carrying a working rifle, a functioning sword, and 500 rounds of live ammunition, and formally surrendered to the officer who had given him his original orders 30 years earlier. The man's name was Hiroo Onoda. He was a second lieutenant of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he had been conducting an active guerrilla campaign on Lubang since December of 1944, raiding food stores, avoiding capture, and maintaining his equipment with the same methodical care that had been drilled into him at military school before the war. His uniform was patched in ways that only jungle materials could patch a uniform. His rifle was in working order. He had not surrendered in 1945 when Japan announced its defeat. He had not surrendered in the 1950s when Philippine search parties swept the island looking for him. He had not surrendered in 1959, or in 1965, or in 1972, and by the time the world found him in early 1974, most people who had known him as a young man were either elderly or dead. The officer standing across from him on that morning, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had to be located in Japan and flown to Lubang specifically for this purpose, because Onoda had made one thing clear through the intermediary who had finally reached him. He would not lay down his arms for anyone except the officer who had given him the order to take them up. Taniguchi was, by 1974, not a military officer at all. He was a bookseller. He came anyway, put on his old uniform, and formally relieved Onoda of his duty. Onoda was 52 years old on the day he walked out of that jungle. Harry Truman had been in his first term when Onoda went in. The Korean War had been fought and ended. The moon had been landed on. A generation of Japanese children had been born into a country that was, by 1974, one of the largest industrial economies on Earth. A country with no memory of the empire it had once been, and Onoda had spent those same years sleeping in the hills of Lubang, eating what the jungle provided, and waiting for orders that would not come until a 23-year-old Japanese adventurer happened to walk into the right part of the forest. The history of the Second World War's end is usually told as a clean event, a ceremony on the deck of a battleship, a date in September, a line drawn across time. What the story of Hiroo Onoda establishes, and what is rarely examined with the seriousness it deserves, is that for some of the men who fought that war, no such line existed. This is not the story of a soldier who was abandoned by his country, though his country did very little to bring him home. It is the story of a man who was given a set of orders and a framework for understanding the world, and who applied that framework with total consistency for 3 decades, in a jungle, alone, against all evidence that the world outside had moved on without him. He was not the first Japanese soldier to emerge from the Pacific decades after the surrender, and he was not the last. On the 26th of December 1944, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda received his orders on Lubang Island from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi of the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Army, and those orders were specific on every point except the one that mattered most: when to stop. The orders themselves were operationally straightforward, at least on paper. Onoda was to destroy the airstrip at Lubang's small military field before American forces could use it. He was to destroy the pier at the harbor so that Allied landing craft could not unload cleanly. He was to organize whatever Japanese troops remained on the island into a guerrilla force and conduct sustained harassment operations against any enemy presence. And then came the line that would govern the next 3 decades of his life. Under no circumstances was he to surrender, and under no circumstances was he to take his own life. He was to fight. He was to keep fighting. He was to fight until he received orders from a superior officer telling him otherwise. Taniguchi did not invent these instructions from nothing. The Philippines campaign by late December 1944 had already moved past the point of conventional defense. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippine archipelago in October, and the Japanese 14th Area Army, which was responsible for the defense of the islands, was being dismantled engagement by engagement across Leyte and Luzon. The Japanese High Command understood that large-scale resistance was no longer viable in the ordinary military sense. What it could still do was make the American advance expensive. Scattered units on secondary islands, operating without supply lines and without reinforcement, could tie down troops, disrupt logistics, and extract a cost in time and manpower that a conventional garrison could not. Lubang was not a strategically critical island. It was one node in a network of deliberate delay, and Onoda was sent there to hold that node for as long as the situation required. What made this possible as an order, what made it something a 22-year-old officer could receive and accept without visible hesitation, was not exceptional personal stubbornness. It was the institutional framework of the Imperial Japanese Army, which had spent the previous decade building a military culture in which surrender did not exist as a legitimate outcome. The Senjin-kun, the field service code issued in January 1941 under War Minister Hideki Tojo, stated the matter plainly. A soldier must never suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. Capture was not misfortune, it was moral failure. A soldier who allowed himself to be captured brought shame that extended outward from himself to his family, to his commanding officers, to his unit, and ultimately to the emperor, whose name sanctioned every order given in the Japanese armed forces. Death in the field was not a tragic outcome, it was the correct one. This was not a position that existed alongside other positions inside the Imperial Japanese Army. It was the only position. Onoda had not arrived at Lubang through the ordinary route of a line infantry officer. He had trained at the Nakano School, the Imperial Japanese Army's dedicated institution for military intelligence and unconventional warfare, located outside Tokyo and largely unknown to the public at the time. The Nakano School did not produce officers intended for frontal engagements. It produced officers intended to operate behind enemy lines, without support, without communication, and without a foreseeable endpoint. Its curriculum covered sabotage, intelligence collection, survival in denied territory, and the psychological conditioning necessary to continue functioning as a military operative when all external verification of the mission had disappeared. The officers it graduated were expected to make independent judgments about tactical situations while remaining absolutely fixed on the strategic purpose they had been given. He had been trained at the Nakano School, Japan's intelligence academy for unconventional warfare, and everything they had taught him pointed in one direction. The soldier who stops fighting before he is ordered to stop has already lost. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945, and Onoda did not believe it. The announcement came from the emperor himself, broadcast over Japanese radio in a recorded address that most of the country heard for the first time on that morning, a voice that millions of Japanese citizens had never heard speaking directly to them, telling them that the war was finished. On Lubang Island, in a jungle that received no radio broadcasts and no newspapers, Onoda and the three men still with him, Private Yuichi Aketsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, heard nothing. The formal surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945 was attended by generals and admirals and recorded by photographers and journalists from every major Allied nation. On Lubang, there were 4 men in deteriorating uniforms eating whatever the jungle gave them, waiting for orders that were not coming. The first indication that something had changed reached them in October 1945, in the form of a leaflet dropped from an aircraft. The text stated that Japan had surrendered unconditionally on the 15th of August, that the war was over, and that Japanese soldiers still in the field were to lay down their arms and present themselves to the nearest Allied or Philippine authority. Onoda and his companions did not discard the leaflet. They examined it. They looked at the paper, the printing quality, the specific wording of the official language, and the formatting of the military designations listed at the bottom. They discussed what they were looking at with the same careful skepticism that Onoda's training at the Nakano school had specifically cultivated. And they concluded, methodically and without great drama, that it was a forgery produced by Allied psychological warfare units. This was not an irrational conclusion to reach in October 1945. Leaflet drops designed to demoralize enemy troops and encourage surrender had been a documented and widely used Allied tactic across every theater of the Pacific War. American and Australian aircraft had dropped millions of surrender leaflets over Japanese positions throughout the island campaigns, and Japanese soldiers had been trained to treat those leaflets as weapons of a different kind, paper instruments designed to accomplish what bullets had not. The 4 men on Lubang had been trained to recognize exactly this kind of operation. A leaflet saying the war was over looked, to someone who had been trained to look for it, precisely like a leaflet designed to make soldiers believe the war was over. Then, in late 1945, a second set of leaflets was dropped over Lubang. These carried a surrender order issued under the name of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese 14th Area Army, the same command structure under which Onoda himself had received his original orders. The signature was there. The formatting was correct. The military language was accurate. Onoda studied those leaflets as well, and he reached the same conclusion. Yamashita, he knew, had been captured by American forces. A captured general's name could be reproduced on any document. The more official the leaflet appeared, the more it resembled exactly the kind of sophisticated forgery that a well-resourced Allied intelligence operation would produce if it wanted Japanese soldiers to believe the order was genuine. The epistemic structure of that reasoning was closed in a way that made it nearly impossible to break from the outside. Every piece of paper that told him the war was over was, by the logic of his training, exactly what a sophisticated enemy psychological operation would look like. For the next 27 years, Hiroo Onoda conducted a guerrilla campaign on an island roughly the size of a medium-sized American county, against an enemy that had long since stopped thinking of itself as his enemy. The group that entered the jungle in 1945 had numbered 4 men. The first to leave was Private Yuichi Akatsu, who separated from the others in September 1949. He spent 6 months alone before surrendering to Philippine forces in March 1950. Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka concluded that Akatsu had deserted his post, and the word they used among themselves was not surrender, but betrayal. They became more cautious after that. They moved camp more frequently. They trusted nothing they had not seen with their own eyes, and they saw with eyes that had been trained to interpret everything as a potential operation against them. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was killed on the 7th of May, 1954, in a firefight with a Philippine Army patrol that had stumbled onto the group's position near the coast. 2 men remained. They continued. Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka survived alongside Onoda for another 18 years before he was killed by local police on the 19th of October, 1972, during one of the raids the 2 men had been conducting for years on that part of the island. The raids followed a specific logic. They would locate rice stores kept by local farmers, set fire to them, and withdraw. In their understanding, this was a military signal, a way of telling any other Japanese forces still operating on Lubang that their unit was alive and active. To the Filipino farmers whose food they were burning, it was something else entirely. After 1972, Onoda was alone. What his daily life looked like during those 3 decades is worth being precise about, because the imagination tends toward the dramatic and the reality was something more grinding than dramatic. He foraged for bananas, coconuts, and whatever the jungle provided. He hunted. He repaired his clothing and equipment with materials he found or fashioned by hand. He maintained his Arisaka rifle with a meticulousness that the people who eventually examined it found remarkable. The mechanism still functional after 3 decades of tropical humidity, because he had cleaned and oiled it with consistent care for 30 years. His uniform had deteriorated past recognition, but he had patched it and repatched it until what he wore bore only a structural relationship to the original garment. He moved, constantly, kept no permanent shelter for long, and tracked the movements of Philippine Army units on the island by watching their patterns over weeks and months. The outside world had not stopped looking for him exactly. Search parties had entered the jungle on multiple occasions over the years. Leaflets had been dropped. Family members had recorded messages that were broadcast over loudspeakers from aircraft flying low over the tree canopy. In one instance that has been recorded in multiple accounts of this period, his own brother flew over Lubang and called his name directly into a loudspeaker system, the voice of a family member descending through the canopy to wherever Onoda was positioned below. Onoda heard it. He concluded it was a recording, manufactured to sound like someone he would recognize. He did not move. The Japanese government had done the same. His family had held a funeral. These were not gestures of indifference. They were the reasonable administrative conclusions of people who had searched for a man in a jungle for years and found nothing. From the outside, the silence of the jungle was the silence of absence. Now, here is the part that the human cost of those 3 decades requires saying plainly. Onoda and his companions killed at least 30 Filipino civilians and police officers over the course of their campaign. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, local officials, and people who happened to be in the path of men who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were still fighting a war. The people they killed were not abstractions in a ledger. They were residents of the same small island, living their lives near a group of men who had not received the news that the killing was supposed to have stopped. The Philippine government had declared him legally dead in absentia. His family had held a funeral, and the man himself was still in the jungle, still maintaining his rifle, still waiting. The man, who finally reached Hiroo Onoda, was not a soldier, not a government official, and not a member of any search party. He was a 23-year-old Japanese drifter named Norio Suzuki, who had decided, with the earnestness of a person who has never been told that certain things are not possible, that he was going to find him. Suzuki had told friends before leaving Japan that he intended to travel the world in search of 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a giant panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He arrived on Lubang in February 1974, carrying no military equipment, no government authorization, and no particular plan beyond walking into the jungle and making himself findable. After 4 days of searching, calling out into the undergrowth, he made contact. Onoda emerged. What happened in that first meeting is worth examining carefully, because it tells you more about Onoda's mind than almost anything else in his 30 years on the island. He was not rattled. He was not desperate. A 52-year-old man who had spent 3 decades conducting a solitary guerrilla campaign in a tropical jungle met a young stranger who had simply walked in from the outside world, and Onoda received him with the composed wariness of someone who had considered this kind of encounter before and prepared for it. He was, by multiple accounts, more puzzled by Suzuki's manner than by his presence. Search parties had come before. What had not come before was someone who arrived alone, unarmed, and without any apparent intent to take him into custody. Suzuki told him the war was over. He told him that Japan had surrendered in August 1945, that nearly 30 years had passed, and that Onoda could go home. Onoda listened, and then he explained, with complete clarity and no apparent distress, that he could not act on what a Japanese civilian told him, regardless of what that civilian believed to be true. His orders had been issued by Major Yoshimi Taniguchi of the 14th Area Army. Those orders had never been rescinded. Until Taniguchi personally relieved him of his duties, the orders remained in effect, and he remained a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, carrying out his assigned mission on Lubang Island. This was not evasion. It was not the response of a man clinging to a delusion he secretly doubted. It was a precise statement of how military authority worked, and Onoda applied it with the same methodical care he had applied to everything else for 30 years. He did not distrust Suzuki exactly. He simply understood that Suzuki had no standing to give him orders, and without orders from the correct source, nothing Suzuki said was actionable. Suzuki went back to Japan with photographs of Onoda as proof, located Taniguchi through military records, and explained what he had found on Lubang. Taniguchi, who had left military service years earlier and was living a quiet civilian life, agreed to return to the island. Suzuki returned to Japan, located Taniguchi, who was by then selling books in a small shop, and told him that his lieutenant was still on Lubang, still in uniform, and still waiting for orders. On the 24th of January, 1972, two farmers checking fish traps along a river on Guam grabbed a thin, startled man who had emerged from the undergrowth near the water and discovered that they had just found a sergeant of the Imperial Japanese Army who had been living alone in the jungle for 28 years. His name was Shoichi Yokoi. He had been a sergeant in the Japanese Army during the American recapture of Guam in 1944, and when United States forces swept back across the island that year, he had retreated into the interior rather than surrender or die in a last stand. He was not, in the early years, entirely alone. He knew of two other Japanese soldiers hiding in the same jungle, and for some time the three of them maintained a loose proximity without ever fully joining their operations. Both of those men died in the late 1960s. By the time the farmers found him in January 1972, Yokoi had been completely alone for several years, living in a hand-dug underground tunnel that he had carved out of the soft earth near the riverbank and roofed with bamboo and jungle vegetation so carefully that nothing about it was visible from above. What he had built inside that tunnel, and in the jungle around it, was not a campsite. It was closer to a workshop. He had woven clothing from the fibers of jungle plants using techniques he had known as a tailor's apprentice before the war. He had carved fishing tools from bamboo, fashioned traps, and developed a foraging system across a small area of the jungle that sustained him at a minimal but functional level for nearly 3 decades. The underground shelter itself had a sleeping area and a separate space for storing his equipment. Investigators who examined it after his discovery described it as a structure that showed an extraordinary degree of patience and practical intelligence applied continuously over years. Now, here's the part that separates Yokoi's case from Onoda's in a way that matters. Yokoi had found leaflets. He knew, by his own later account, that the war had been over for years. He understood that Japan had surrendered and that there was no military mission left on Guam. He stayed in the jungle regardless, and the reason he gave when he returned to Japan was not ideology or confusion. It was shame. The idea of walking back into Japanese society as a man who had survived when so many had not, as a man who had endured rather than died honorably, was something he could not bring himself to do. When he was finally brought home to Japan at the age of 57, he made a public statement that became one of the most quoted sentences to come out of the entire holdout phenomenon. He said, in words recorded and reported across the Japanese press, that it was with much embarrassment that he returned. The Japanese public did not respond with embarrassment. They received him as a national hero, and the attention his case generated was still at its height 2 years later, when Onoda walked out of the Philippine jungle. The pattern that Yokoi and Onoda together established, 2 men, 2 islands, 2 separate forms of the same refusal, was not the complete picture. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, other cases had accumulated over the decades since 1945, varying in duration and circumstance but sharing the same basic structure. A soldier left behind by a retreating force in terrain too remote to sweep thoroughly, sustained by a combination of skill, stubbornness, and a military culture that had given him no acceptable alternative to continuing. Teruo Nakamura, an indigenous Taiwanese soldier conscripted into Japanese service, was found on the Indonesian island of Morotai in December 1974, 9 months after Onoda walked out of the Philippine jungle, and he is generally considered the last verified Japanese holdout from the Second World War. The easy answer to why these men stayed is military fanaticism, and it is not wrong, but it is not complete. The first part of the real answer is systematic, and it was built long before any of these men set foot on a Pacific island. The Imperial Japanese Army did not simply discourage surrender, it criminalized it. The Senjin Kun, the military field code issued by General Hideki Tojo in January 1941, stated explicitly that a soldier must never suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. This was not a suggestion buried in the back pages of a manual that no one read. It was recited, rehearsed, and reinforced from the first weeks of induction through the entire duration of a soldier's service. The few men who were captured by Allied forces and somehow made their way back to Japan were not welcomed home. They were court-martialed, publicly shamed, and in some cases imprisoned. Their families experienced consequences. The code was not abstract. It had teeth, and every soldier in the Imperial Army knew exactly what those teeth looked like. The second part of the answer is tactical, and it is something that the simplified version of this story almost never addresses. Most of the men who became holdouts had not been defeated in the field. They had been bypassed. The Allied strategy across the Pacific after 1943 was built around island hopping, which meant that large Japanese garrisons on strategically secondary islands were deliberately left behind rather than reduced at enormous cost. The men on those islands had not surrendered. They had not been overrun. They had retreated into terrain that no Allied commander had any particular reason to clear, and from their position inside that terrain, the war had not ended. It had moved. When you have never been beaten, the proposition that your side has lost requires a level of evidence that a leaflet dropped from an airplane simply cannot supply. The third part of the answer is epistemic, and it is in some ways the most important. Psychological warfare leaflet drops had been a documented and widely used Allied tactic throughout the entire Pacific campaign. Every Japanese soldier with any intelligence training knew this. When the first leaflets announcing the surrender began falling on Lubang in October 1945, Onoda and his companions did not ignore them. They studied them. They examined the paper stock, the typeface, the precise wording, the chain of command cited in the text, and what they concluded was that a genuine order to surrender would not arrive on a piece of paper dropped from an airplane by the enemy. It would arrive through proper military channels, from a superior officer with the authority to issue it. The more elaborate, too, the effort to reach them became, the more it confirmed what they already believed, which was that something significant was still being contested on their island, and that a well-resourced enemy was willing to invest considerable effort in making them think otherwise. Every piece of evidence pointing toward the war's end was also consistent, under this logic, with an enemy who wanted them to believe the war had ended. The two explanations were, from inside the jungle, almost impossible to separate. The fourth part of the answer is the one that appears least often in the accounts written about these men, and it requires a certain care to state accurately. Some of the holdouts knew the war was over. Shoichi Yokoi had found leaflets years before he was discovered in 1972. He understood what they said. He remained in his underground shelter on Guam, not because he believed the fighting was ongoing, but because he could not bring himself to walk out. The Japan he would be returning to was a Japan that had lost, and he had survived rather than died, which under the code he had been raised inside was itself a thing that required explanation. His first public statement upon returning home was that it was with great embarrassment that he returned. That sentence is not the statement of a man who was confused about the facts. It is the statement of a man who had spent years dreading the moment he would have to say it. The jungle was brutal and isolated and lonely in ways that are difficult to fully account for, but it did not ask him any questions. Some of them knew perfectly well that the war was over, and stayed in the jungle anyway because the jungle did not require them to explain anything to anyone.